Okay, low frequency oscillators. A very quick description is that it does the same thing as the oscillators we were talking about. And it can do all the same things that we were talking about with those oscillators. But normally it's below 20 hertz. So you really kind of have to watch those other videos to understand that if you don't understand what I'm talking about. It's lower register frequencies because most of the time all the effects that we talked about, such as phase and frequency and volume and all those things, is to use that waveform to modulate up and down that primary sound that you're working with. So that's a very simple description of it. And to give an explanation is that, let's say you've created a sound and it's you've got the sound sculpted with the oscillator, and so you hooked it up to low frequency oscillator because you want the volume to modulate or the frequency to modulate or the phase to modulate. Or anything else going on it, that you connect it to the low frequency oscillator. Now the volume, that signal that you created with that first oscillator, is going to ride on top of this signal, so that as it goes along, volume automation or volume modulation is a prime example. Then the volume will go up as it goes along this waveform. It'll go down as it goes on this waveform. It'll go back up as it goes on this waveform. So that volume will modulate up and down, or the frequency will modulate up and down, or the phase will modulate up and down. With the modulating the basic things, the basic synthesis concepts we were talking about. So and that's the basic understanding of it. It can be a little bit more complex than that, but that's a basic understanding. So when somebody talks about a low frequency oscillator, most of the time that it's used to modulate one of the synthesis techniques that we've used. So you've got the frequency or the volume or the phase or whatever that you're trying to modulate up and down. Vibrato is a prime example, of frequency modulation, that it's modulating up and down. You've put it on an LFO. You've set the LFO at so many hertz. The lower the hertz, the slower the modulation. The higher the hertz, the faster the modulation. Does that make sense? And that's a real simple understanding of what it's doing. So let's take a look at it. So basically, just to reiterate, using this synthesis example, is that here's the frequency area, the tunings, and you're going to connect this to the low frequency oscillator so that it's going to modulate that tuning, the frequency up or down, or it's going to modulate the phase. It's going to modulate the phase up and down, the phase distortion, though that can be kind of fuzzy. So, but the basic same concept, that it's modulating it up and down. Or it might be modulating this other parameter by connecting it to the LFO, or the volume itself, just the decibels, modulating it up and down in volume. And that's the basic concept of it. So let's take a little closer look. So the first thing we see is, just like the oscillator, it's going to have a wavetable. On this one, it actually has a random wave here, a random square kind of pulse kind of wave that's randomized. But basically, the first thing is we're seeing that. Now, that can also have the arbitrary waveform generator on it and things like that also. But basically, that's the first thing you see that is basically similar to the oscillator, except for its lower frequencies. And like we said, normally below 20 hertz, so that the oscillation is slow. Because otherwise the modulation, would be super fast and wouldn't be of any use. The modulation of the sinusoid has to be at lower cycles and slower cycles, so that it can modulate up and down, so that it's audible, that you can actually hear the modulation. So that's the first thing, and that's similar to the normal oscillator. So the next thing we look at is, normally there's a rate on here, and that's normally going to change the frequency, because you can see right there it starts out at 0.01 hertz and then it goes up to 8 hertz. So that's basically how fast the modulation is, so that how fast that goes or how slow that goes, and that's basically normal, a basic description of the rate. And the other thing is delay, because sometimes, like, let's say you've got like a violin and it starts out on a note, and then towards the end of the note it starts to modulate. It's like na, or a vocal, is an example right there, that that the delay, when it starts to modulate after the initial hit, that it's going to go so long before it actually starts to do modulation, like a voice like that, like you sing a note and then it starts to modulate at the end. And that's just a basic description of those two parameters. All right. The other thing is, that if you look at it, that a lot of times it can have all the same parameters as the oscillator that you're building the sound from for modulation. And, to try to approach it the same way that we approach the oscillator to see what it's doing, that it's basically it's an oscillator itself. So how that, what all parameters might be on there that you need to look at the same way you look at the oscillator, but with the understanding of what its function is to oscillate some parameter up and down at some speed. And an example of that is, let's say you've got the oscillator here, you've chosen it, if you've chosen this oscillator, because on this synth you can put that oscillator on all kinds of different things to direct it to modulate different things. And on here that, it'll basically modulate just about everything on here. It'll modulate the oscillators that we've talked about. It'll modulate things going on in the filter. It'll modulate things going on the ADSR. It'll modulate just about all these parameters that you've set up, and it will actually modulate them in different ways. So the combinations of how you can do all kinds of different modulations with that, or what all you can modulate, is really going to depend on, your synthesizer. But that's just a basic understanding, and what it's set up to do. I mean, it can even modulate noise or, any other parameter you have on your synthesizer. And the other thing is being in sync. Sometimes they'll be synced to the tempo. And then might probably run into some parameters, just like on the normal oscillator, that are nondescript, that, are going to be specific to that keyboard, or to that synthesizer, that, that aren't addressing, the basic issues we talked about, or might be addressing them in some specific way unique to that synthesizer. But, with the basic understanding of what the LFO is there for, to modulate some parameter. Its basic thing at first was to modulate the oscillator, whatever whatever waveform or whatever you've done over here to modulate that. Does that make sense? Do some modulation of that. But it's gone to the point now where it can modulate any parameter on your synthesizer almost, to where anything that you've done on the synthesizer that you can actually modulate it. An example is the filter here, the cutoff on the filter that I've hooked it up to the LFO, to where, the filter cut off to where it's a low pass filter, and then it's modulating up to high pass filter and back and forth. So it's doing effects like that. So it can do all kinds of different things. And to get into everything it's doing, we're not going to right now. We're just looking at what it is and what its basic function is. So I hope I laid that out there to where when you look at the LFO now, that you've got a pretty good understanding of what it's, what it is, that it's another oscillator. It's a low frequency oscillator, so that the actual modulation of the sinusoid or whatever waveform that you have is slow enough so that it can modulate whatever you're trying to attach to it audibly, so that it's not so fast, because higher register hertz, higher frequencies are going to be so fast that you're not going to even hear. It's not even hardly be audible that it's modulating. So it's normally lower frequency modulations of the sinusoid or whatever waveform, so that you can apply it some type of modulation to some parameter on your synthesizer. So I hope that described that clear enough and basically enough so that just the basic concept of what it is clear in your mind. And then to approach it after you understand that basic concept and the basic function of the LFO, then to start looking at that oscillator the same as you do the other oscillator. What else is on there? How is that being applied, or how is that addressing the concepts of synthesis that we've talked about, the basic concepts, and or is it trying to do some other thing that, that isn't one of the basic synthesis concepts, that may be doing something cool to help create something, or randomness for the things to sound more natural, or some off the wall parameter. Who knows? Sometimes, people creating sound will come up with all kinds of crazy parameters, the basic thing is to look at it the same way you looked at the oscillator, but that its oscillator is for the function of modulation. And then just try to keep it that simple in your head, and you should be able to go through whatever parameters are on the LFO on your synthesizer and get a pretty good understanding of what it's trying to do and its capabilities as far as what it can do as far as modulation in your synthesis process. So I hope you enjoyed that video and you understand basically what the LFO is, low frequency oscillator, and that now that it's not confusing in no way, shape, or form, and you can relate it to the actual oscillator that we're producing sound with and what its purpose is for modulating some parameter on your synthesis, on your synthesizer. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Peace, hope, love, and we're going to address ADSR next.